Hello and welcome to the online information session for the Public Scholars Program of the National Endowment for the Humanities. My name is Mark Silver. I'm a program officer in the NEH Division of Research Programs. Also on the call is my colleague Gwen Yates, who serves as the program analyst for the Public Scholars Program and who will be helping me field the questions in the latter part of the session today. This session is scheduled to last for 1 hour from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock Eastern Time. I'm planning to make a presentation that should last about 30 minutes, and then I will take questions from you for the remainder of the hour. I have an overview of the topics that I'm planning to cover. I'll start off by talking about the goals of the program and its scope. I'll explain the eligibility requirements. I'll go over some key details of the program, including the time commitment that we expect from grant recipients. We'll take a look at the review criteria, the application materials that you have to submit, and the mechanics of submitting your application. And then we'll get to your questions. And you should feel free to type questions into the questions box at any time during the presentation. And I'll answer as many as I can at the end. If we don't get to your question, you should feel free to send us an email containing that question. Our email address is publicscholars@neh.gov, and I will put it up on the final slide. My hope is that this session will help you decide whether the Public Scholars Program is right for you. And if you decide that it is right for you, a good fit for you and your project, that you'll understand what it takes to submit a strong application to the program. We will, by the way, be posting a recording of this session. So if you want to refer to it later as you're preparing an application, it will be available on the NEH website. It'll take us about a week to post it, but we will be putting that up. All right, let's get started then. First, I want to talk about the goals of the program. Our overarching goal is to support the creation of well-researched nonfiction books in the humanities that are written for the broad public. Related to that goal, we want to encourage writers outside the academic world to deepen their engagement with the humanities by strengthening the research underlying their books. We know that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to do thorough research, and that it's not always possible when you're writing a book to put as much research into it as you might hope to. So we want to help solve that problem. We also want to encourage academic writers in the humanities to communicate the significance of their research to the broadest possible range of readers. Just as it takes time and effort to do good research, it also takes time and effort to write effectively for a general audience. And if you're a professional scholar, it's in some ways easier to write for other scholars. That's probably what you were trained to do. So writing for a general audience requires some adjustment. You might have to find a new voice in your writing. And we want, with this program, to encourage you to make that adjustment. The scope of the program is covered on the next slide. We welcome applications in all areas of the humanities. So it doesn't matter what your geographic or chronological focus is. If you look at the list of awards that we've made so far in this program, and there are about 200 or so far, you'll see that list is dominated by projects with an American focus, but we don't actually have a preference for an American focus in this program. That's just a reflection of the proportion of American to non-American focused applications that we get. But we do welcome proposals having to do with any geographic area or historical period. The books must be written in a readily accessible style, and they must frame their topics to have wide appeal. This is absolutely crucial in this program. If you're not interested in devoting energy to these things, then this is not the right program for you. And as the slide says, books written primarily for an audience of professional scholars are not suitable. So that's just to reiterate the point. The next slide shows some recent and forthcoming books that we've sponsored in this program. On the left is a book by the independent writer Alison Macor called Making the Best Years of Our Lives, the Hollywood classic that inspired a nation. And that was published by the University of Texas Press just last June. In the middle is Sister Novelists, the trailblazing Porter sisters who paved the way for Austen and the Brontes. And this is by Devaney Lozer, who's a professor at Arizona State University, and that's coming out from Bloomsbury later this month. On the right is Jacob Soll's book, Free Market, The History of an Idea, which was published last month by Basic Books. Jacob Soll teaches at the University of Southern California. So those are some examples, as I said, of books that have been sponsored by the program. Before we go too much deeper, I want to just pause for a moment and talk about what we mean by the humanities. The founding legislation of the National Endowment for the Humanities lists a number of disciplines that are meant to be encompassed by the term humanities. That legislation also makes clear that this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but it does mention these disciplines on the slide: history, literature and language, history and theory of the arts, philosophy and ethics, archaeology, comparative religion, jurisprudence, and those social sciences employing humanistic methods, which is to say primarily qualitative methods as opposed to quantitative methods. If you're uncertain about whether your project would fall within the humanities or not, we're happy to discuss that question with you and give you some guidance. So feel free to get in touch with us if you have questions about that. Next, the eligibility requirements for the program. The program is open to all US citizens. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, and also to foreign nationals who've been living in the US for the 3 years preceding the November 30th application deadline. We also have a publication requirement. You must have previous publication record. And you can meet this requirement in one of two ways: either with a nonfiction book published with a trade press or a university press. So an academic monograph would be fine to meet this requirement. Or you could meet it with 3 articles or essays in general interest publications that reach a large audience. You do not have to have an advanced degree to apply to this program. We don't allow you to apply if you're a currently enrolled student, though. No institutional affiliation is required. And in fact, on that last point, we have a special encouragement for independent writers. We're encouraging applications from writers who are not currently affiliated with a college or university. So maybe you're a full-time historian or biographer, you're a journalist or a magazine writer or an editor, or maybe you have a day job that's unrelated to writing and you write at night. If you have a suitable project, we want you to know about this opportunity. We also know that there are people who have only a short-term affiliation with a college or a university, who might, for various reasons, have one foot in the academic world and one foot out. We want you to be aware of this program and the support that it could offer you as well. Then in parentheses, I say professional academics are also entirely welcome. And that's true. This special encouragement is not meant to discourage professional academics. We absolutely want to hear from full-time university or college professors as applicants. It's just that the application pool tends to be dominated by professional scholars already, and we want to broaden our reach to other kinds of applicants because we know you're out there. Next, projects not supported by the program. There are a number of types of projects that we do not support, and you need to be aware of these if you're contemplating submitting an application. So the program does not support creative nonfiction. We wouldn't allow a book in which you would be inventing scenes or dialogue as part of the book. We don't support autobiography or memoir in this program, or books for children or young adults, works of graphic fiction, such as graphic novels or graphic nonfiction. We do not support dissertation revisions or translations or anthologies. So you want to be sure to check the list in the notice of funding opportunity of prohibitions. This is not a complete list here. There are more. And that list is in section D6 of the notice of funding opportunity. And as I said, you want to be sure to check that list because you don't want to submit an application that will be a non-starter because you're proposing something that is a prohibited project type. All right, key program details. So here are a number of sort of important parameters for this program as you're assessing the fit for you. We're buying your time with these awards, so we're very strict about rules regarding duration and time commitment. The minimum duration is 6 months of full-time work or the equivalent. So you could, for example, work half-time for 12 months on your project, and that would meet the requirement since it's the equivalent of 6 full-time months. The maximum duration is 12 months, and that's true even if you're working part-time on the project. So you cannot run your calendar longer than 12 months under any circumstances. You cannot work less than half-time at any point during the award period. So keep that in mind. Also, you can't break up your award period. You must hold the award continuously. How much money are we awarding here? The stipend is $5,000 per full-time month. So the maximum award is $60,000, which would be for 12 full-time months. We reduce that dollar amount accordingly in the event that you're working part-time or you're working less than 12 full months on the project. The application deadline is November 30th, 2022, and you'll hear an answer from us in the first half of August of 2023. So it takes us about 9 months to review your application and give you an answer, and you need to account for that in your planning. If you were to be notified that you've won an award in August of 2023, the earliest possible start date would be September 1st. In other words, you could start holding the award almost right after you got the news. The latest possible start date would be 1 year after that, which would be September 1st of 2024. So again, as you're planning your project and your schedule, you need to be well aware of the timeline that I've presented here and take that into account. Typical activities and products in this program. We support research in primary and secondary sources. That could include interviews or field work of some kind. We support travel to archives and work in archives and other research sites, and also writing and revision of your manuscript, or a mix of all of these things. Typical products are print books, generally published with a trade press or with a university press that has strong distribution. You're permitted to propose online materials that would supplement your book, but the primary product in that case would still have to be a print book. We also see people including ebooks and/or audiobooks as part of their publication plan, and that's also perfectly welcome. This slide shows the review criteria. Every application will be reviewed by a panel of external peer reviewers, and these are the criteria we instruct them to use in their evaluations. As an applicant, you absolutely must keep these criteria in mind as you're preparing your application, and you should try to write the application to answer these criteria. These criteria are, by the way, published in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. I'll take a moment to talk you through them. The first one is the appeal and intellectual significance of the proposed book for general readers. This is the #1 criterion for a reason. It's in many ways the most important one. And both aspects of it, the appeal and also the intellectual significance, are important. So your topic should be framed in a way to make it engaging and interesting. The writing should carry the reader along without undue effort. But the book should also have substance to it. Second criterion, the applicant's record of research and experience in interpreting the humanities for general audiences. As an applicant, you want to think about how to highlight your record in these areas, both on your resume and also in your application narrative. Third, the quality of the conception, definition, organization, and description of the project, and the breadth and depth of the humanities research underlying the project. Your project should be well defined and well organized. The book should be based on rigorous research, and your application should show that you're aware of the relevant sources for your project and also of related books in your area. The fourth criterion is the quality of the writing sample and the applicant's clarity of expression. The writing sample is extremely important in this program because that's where you're demonstrating to the evaluators that you really know how to write for a popular audience. We recommend that you submit a draft chapter from your proposed book as the writing sample if you possibly can. But we realize not everyone will be in a position to do that, and that's all right. If you're submitting something that you've previously written or published, just make sure that the selection really showcases your skill as a writer for general readers. That's the most important thing that evaluators will be looking for in your writing sample. The fifth criterion is the feasibility and appropriateness of the proposed plan of work. And it continues to list also the soundness and probable reach of the dissemination plan and the likelihood that the applicant will complete the project, which doesn't, by the way, necessarily have to occur during the grant period. You're perfectly welcome to make progress towards completing the project and then finish it after the award period. On the work plan mentioned here in criterion number 5, what you should do is present us with a clear schedule of the tasks that you're going to carry out, indicating the amount of time that you're going to devote to each one of those tasks. Your application should also address the question of dissemination. How are you going to publish the book? How will you make sure it gets noticed? You want to think about the press that you're going to publish the book with. And in general, the bigger the print run that press is capable of, and the stronger their publicity and distribution, the stronger your position will be as an applicant. It will help your application to have a contract in hand at the time you apply, but that is not required. Probably about half the projects that we've funded so far did not have a contract at the time of application. This slide shows the application materials that we ask you to submit. And first of all, before I go through them, I want to point out that there are page limits here on nearly every item. You have to adhere to those page limits. We're sticklers about that. And you will be disqualified if you don't adhere to the page limits and follow our formatting instructions. We disqualify people on those grounds in every round, and we don't like to do that, but we need to have uniformity of format and length for our evaluators who are reading the materials. All right, so what materials do we ask for? First of all, a 3-page narrative statement explaining your project, and you should follow the guidelines in the notice of funding opportunity as you write that narrative statement. Next, a separate 1-page plan of work, then a 1-page bibliography, and a 1,000-character project summary. We also require a 2-page resume or CV, a 20-page writing sample, and a publisher's letter if applicable. So if you have interest from a publisher, or if your book is under contract with a publisher, you should submit a letter with your application from the press indicating its level of commitment to your project. And if your book is under contract and you've discussed the size of a possible print run with the publisher, I would encourage you to ask the representative of the press to include that information in the letter as well, and also to mention any plans for publicity that that might be done in connection with your book. You should arrange for 2 letters of reference, and those are not actually due until January 24th, several weeks after the application deadline. You should coach your letter writers to study those evaluation criteria that we looked at and to address them explicitly in their letters. You should also coach your letter writers to specifically address your proposed project, rather than simply talking about previous work that you may have done and then ending with a line to say, and I'm sure the proposed project will be just as good. It's really much more effective to have the letter writer address the specifics of the project that you're currently proposing. Then additional online forms. There's some other forms in the application package asking you to identify your letter writers, to list the locations where you'll be working during the grant period, and to provide your address and contact information. The last note on this slide says no budget is required. And that's because, as I explained before, the dollar amount of the award is based on the number of months that you commit to as your grant period. So it's a very straightforward calculation based on that $5,000 per month stipend that I mentioned. We have a number of resources for applicants that you should be aware of as you're working on an application. The single most important one is the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which I've mentioned several times already. This document is available as a link on the web page that you used to join this online information session. That Notice of Funding Opportunity is about a 20-page PDF, and it contains all the instructions for assembling and formatting your materials, as well as instructions for actually submitting them to us. So if you're not familiar yet with the Notice of Funding Opportunity and you think you're interested in the program, that would definitely be your next step. Take a look at that document, read through it carefully. We also have available on the website a number of sample application narratives. There are 9 examples there of successful applications that you can study. There's also a list of recently funded projects and another document there with frequently asked questions that you can refer to as well. All of those things are available at the link on the slide here. As I said, that's the same page that contains the link for joining this information session today. Last bullet point on this list, and not to be neglected, is advice from the NEH staff. This is the email address and phone number that you can use to reach us. We're at publicscholars@neh.gov, and the phone number is 202-606-8200. We can usually get back to you more quickly if you send an email, but we are available by phone as well. We are not able to comment on draft applications, but we can respond to specific questions that you have about your application as you're preparing it. A word about the mechanics of submitting your application. You'll need to register at the website grants.gov, which is the portal that you'll use to submit your application. And as part of that registration process, you'll also need to create an account at login.gov, which is a separate website that issues credentials to users of grants.gov. Once you've registered, you have to create an individual applicant profile in your account. That's what I have here as the second step at the left on this slide. A lot of people overlook this. This is probably the #1 mistake, in fact, that people make when they're trying to submit applications to us. And the symptom that you have not set up an individual applicant profile is that this red button here that says apply, I have a yellow arrow pointing to it, that red button will be grayed out. It will be gray instead of red, and it won't work. So you won't be able to click on it. You won't be able to submit your application. And that's because this program is only open to individual applicants, not to organizations as applicants. And if you have not set up an individual applicant profile, the grants.gov system won't realize that you're eligible to submit an application, and it will block you out. So be sure to set up an individual applicant profile and the details of how to do that are explained in the notice of funding opportunity. Third point here is that you should submit several days early in case of technical problems. You may run into a hurdle of some kind, especially if you're submitting an application to us for the first time. It can be somewhat cumbersome, so allow some extra time so that you're not scrambling a few hours before the application deadline, which we do strictly enforce. Then the last point here is that there is a help desk run by grants.gov, and that phone number is 1-800-518-4726, or you can email them at support@grants.gov. The people at that help desk can help you with technical problems much better than we here at NEH can. So I encourage you to call the help desk at grants.gov or send them an email if you're having a problem using the grants.gov website or a technical problem with submitting your application. That brings me to the end of the presentation that I've prepared. I've put up our contact information here again as promised, and I'm prepared now to take some questions. I think some of you have been submitting them along the way, or if you have a question that you'd like to submit now, please feel free to do that using the questions box, and we'll do our best to help you. Gwen, if you're there and we have some questions that have come in, let me know what we've got.
Yes, Mark, we have quite a few questions. I don't know if we're going to get to them all, but the first question here is, I'm working on a very interdisciplinary project in science and literature. Have you had projects that relate to science in any way?
The answer is yes, and we're certainly open to projects that are interdisciplinary in nature. We've certainly funded projects in the field of history of science. I can think of one called Waters of the World, which is about the science of the oceans and the atmosphere, that falls squarely within this sort of scientific orientation, and others as well. If you look at our list of previously funded projects, I think you'll see things in history of medicine as well. So that is by no means disqualifying that you're interested in a project that connects the humanities with science in some way.
Okay. Where is the site of work if it is just at my desk at home? How do I talk about that? I've completed field work and all research and writing will take place at my desk.
Yeah, so that's perfectly fine. We fund projects at any stage of development in this program, and you may already have completed your research and you simply need time in your life to write. Explain that that's where you are in the process in your application, and in your work plan you would indicate which sections of the project you're going to be writing, and how long you expect to write each one of them, to take writing each one of them. There is, among those online forms that I mentioned, there's one called the project site location form. And on that one, you would just indicate that you're going to be working at your own residence or your own office. And that's fine. It's not a strike against you that you're not planning travel to an exotic location as part of the grant activities.
Many of the sample narratives you post online indicate that applicants have already lined up publishers for their book. Do you prefer that we come to you with a publisher?
It's a great question. The record so far, if you look at our the awards that we've made, about half of the applicants that won awards did have a contract in hand at the time they applied, which means half didn't. We don't have a preference for late stage projects versus earlier stage projects. But you should keep in mind that the dissemination plan and the soundness of the dissemination plan is one of the evaluation criteria. So if you do have a publisher lined up, that often will help convince the evaluators that the project is really going to come to fruition, that it will be published and get wide distribution and reach the general audience that we want to reach with this program. If you don't have a publisher lined up yet, I would definitely spend some time in your narrative statement talking about your plans for publication. Do you have particular publishers in mind that you think would be a good fit for you? If so, I would name them. I would talk about how you're going to approach them. Are you going to send them a particular chapter as a book proposal? I would give details about your strategy for bringing the book to publication. Some applicants are working with an agent but don't yet have a publisher. If you're in that category, I would certainly mention that you have an agent that you're working with. If you have a record of previous books, you could talk about that and the confidence that it gives you in approaching publishers, or ideas about possibly approaching a publisher that you've worked with already. So in a nutshell, the more detail that you can provide about the dissemination plan in order to convince the evaluators that it is indeed a sound plan, the better off you'll be. But we certainly have funded applicants who did not have a contract yet at the time that they apply.
Who outside academics would make for a good reference? Alternatively, who would be a bad reference?
Yeah. The best reference letters speak in detail about the project that you're proposing. So you should look for someone, I think above all, who is willing to take the time to make the investment to give your proposal a good reading and to write a nice meaty paragraph in the letter that they're going to supply about your proposed project and why it matters. Now, that person could be an academic. They certainly wouldn't have to be an academic. And if you're an academic yourself, you might consider asking someone who's not an academic for a letter to sort of balance out your own identity. And I think the reverse might hold true as well. If you're outside the academic world, you might think about asking at least one person who is in the academic world to write for you. But what you want is you want people who will take the time to write in detail about your proposal. You want people who are in a position to write with some authority about the topic that you're working on yourself. And then ideally, you also want people who have some knowledge or experience of writing or editing for general readers, and could vouch for the appeal of your project for general readers. Now, it's probably unusual to get one person, you know, who would sort of fulfill every one of those points I just mentioned, but between the two recommenders, if you can cover those things, then I think you'd be in a strong position. The other thing to say, though, is that it's unlikely that recommenders will carry a project that's somewhat weak in the first place. So really, in the grand scheme of things, your narrative proposal and your writing sample are really far more likely to be making or breaking you than the letters that you have included with the application file.
Does published opinion articles count?
So I'm assuming the question is in reference to our previous publication requirement. And if so, that requirement, just to review it, is that you must either have published a nonfiction book with a trade press or a university press. Or if you haven't published a book previously, you can meet the requirement with 3 articles or essays published in general interest publications that reach a wide audience. So an op-ed, an opinion piece that was published in a general interest publication with a big audience would indeed meet that requirement. So we don't have a requirement that those articles or essays or pieces of writing be of a certain length. So an op-ed published in a major national newspaper, for example, would indeed meet that requirement.
I am a staff at a university in a position that is entirely unrelated to my writing project. Is that considered to be an affiliation?
If you have an affiliation with a university or a college, even if it has nothing to do with your writing, we would still consider that an institutional affiliation. It doesn't put you at a disadvantage to have an institutional affiliation. So I wouldn't worry about making that sort of fine distinction to say that I do have an affiliation, but my project is sort of not in the area that I work in for my institution. So the answer is yes, we'd consider it an affiliation, but it's not going to count against you that you have that affiliation.
How large of an audience is needed for previous article publications? Did you answer that, Mark?
No, I didn't. I've referred a couple of times to articles or essays in general interest publications that reach a large audience. And so the question is, well, what do we mean by a large audience? Generally, we mean a large national or international audience. I realize that there is something of a gray area. Perhaps you may have a question about whether your particular publications meet that requirement or not. And you're welcome to contact us about that and give us some details about your publication record, and we can give you a verdict on whether you meet the requirement or not.
Can a dissertation count for a publication?
No, is the short answer to that. If you had revised your dissertation and published it subsequently as a book with a university press or with a trade press, although that's less likely, then it would be countable. It would meet that requirement by virtue of having published a book. But some universities publish dissertations as they're submitted to meet the degree requirements, or they're archived with a website that archives dissertations. That doesn't count as having been published with a university press or a trade press. So you'd have to carry your dissertation to a subsequent step of revision and publication with a press in order to use it to satisfy the requirement.
I thought I saw translations as supported in the past. What if translation is part of the proposed book, say half of the book?
So we've always had a prohibition on translations in the Public Scholars Program. We do have other programs at the National Endowment for the Humanities that support translations. The Fellowships Program and summer stipends, for example, do. Now, what if the project includes translation? That's likely to be okay. I mean, we recognize that just because a project includes translation, that doesn't make it its full identity necessarily a translation project. You might want to get in touch with us about exactly what you have in mind in terms of framing the project, explaining it, and presenting it. If you're doing something where a translation would take up a very large proportion of the finished project. But you're certainly welcome to work with materials in foreign languages and translate them, or excerpt translations, or include reference to translations of works in foreign language as part of the book project. There's absolutely no hurdle there as far as that goes. The issue would be with proposing a product that could shade into having an identity as a translation project. So for the person who's referring to half of the product being taken up by a translation, who asked the question, my suggestion would be to send us an email and give us some more details, and we can give you some guidance about it.
Do you support narrative nonfiction? I am a journalist and the genre doesn't allow for invented dialogue or characters, but there is some degree of creativity. It's factual but novelistic.
Yeah, narrative nonfiction is not a problem phrase for us in the way that creative nonfiction is. As long as you're able to document the things that you're presenting to the reader, then if it's narrative in style, then that's perfectly okay. You would need to be careful, though. There's a temptation sometimes when writing history, say, in narrative style, to insert details that are sort of, bringing the scene to life, but you can't really document. Maybe the weather report says it was a very hot day that day, that when you're describing someone doing something. But that doesn't necessarily give you license to say he'd never been so hot in his life, or his shirt was soaked with sweat, if you don't really have documentation for that sort of detail.
Is there a preference for applications on the front end of a project, initial archival research, or the back end, writing completion? A project like this is going to take more than a year.
Yeah, the answer is no. We don't have a preference in that way. We support projects at any stage of development in this program. Those at an early stage, I would caution people to have, even though they're at an early stage, to present as fully realized a vision for what the book is going to be as you possibly can. You don't want the application to be sort of creating the impression that you're deferring a lot of the sort of thought about what the book is going to be until you've got more information. And you may need more information before you can really put it in final form, but you should still do some kind of projection of what your vision for the book is going to be, even if you're still at an early stage, because having that vision helps ensure the evaluators that you know what you're looking for in the early stages. But as far as a distinct preference for one stage or the other, we don't have such a preference. We certainly understand that these kinds of book projects do take more than a year in general to pull off. And so you're certainly welcome in the plan of work that you devise to carve out a piece of the research and or writing process, and to set that as your goal for the grant period to accomplish that piece. I would also include some indication of how you're eventually going to finish the project if you're not talking about writing to the point of submitting the manuscript by the end of the grant period. So give some indication of how you expect to have the time eventually to finish it, and when you think it would ultimately be submitted to a publisher and appear and be available to the public.
Is it possible to fill in the online forms over the course of several days?
Yes, it is. You can start the forms and then come back to them later.
Will NEH reach out to the letter writers on and about, I'm sorry, I already answered that one. Let's skip that one.
I'm not sure we did talk about the schedule for soliciting the letters. Is the person asking when we'll contact the letter writers?
Yes, I did respond to them that the letter writers will be contacted on or around January 8th, 2023, January 9th, 2023. And they have 2 weeks.
Oh, you did that in the chat. Yeah, that's right. So what happens is people submit their application, and then a letter writer will send them an email and say, you know, I haven't heard anything from NEH. You better check into that. It's normal that they do not hear from us until after the new year. So that date that Gwen gave you, January 9th, is on or about that date. So within a couple of days of that date is when we're going to send out the solicitation to the letter writers. So if we get to, you know, New Year's Eve and they still haven't heard from us, that's as it should be. That's entirely normal and no cause for worry.
Can you give some examples of good answers to review criterion 3, which asks applicants to demonstrate the breadth and depth of the humanities research underlying the project? Does that mean using many different kinds of sources, archival, interviews, artifacts, etc.?
It really depends on the project that you're working on, and we don't have a requirement that you use many different types of sources necessarily. It may be that what's called for in your case is a very thorough analysis of one particular set of letters that are in an archive somewhere. Depending on the project that you're proposing, what you need to do is convince the evaluators that you're looking at the right sources and the right sort of range of sources for that particular project. And the answer to that criterion is going to be probably sort of suffused throughout the project. I mean, the way you describe the project and what you're doing and what's interesting about it is going to help give the evaluators a sense of how deeply you've researched this, and whether you're aware of other books that may be out there that are relevant and important to know about in your carrying out of the project that you've proposed. So I would certainly talk about your sources and your organization for the project in the narrative, but be aware that in a way, everything you say about the project as you're describing it is giving the evaluators a sense of the breadth and depth of the research underlying the project.
I have ghostwritten 2 books. Does that count?
You must be the author of the books that you're using to establish your eligibility for the program. So if you're not the author of the book, then unfortunately it wouldn't count.
If I need to rely on a writing sample from a past published project, I'm in the research phase. Would it be an issue to provide a sample on a different topic? Or should I choose a sample which may not be as strong of a piece of writing, but which is the topic area?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's somewhat difficult to give a definite answer about that. As I said, the most important thing you need to do with the writing sample is to establish your ability to write for a general audience. So if the piece you have that does that best is on a separate topic, I would tend to lean towards that rather than a weaker piece that's in the topic area. But without having more information about exactly what those two pieces are that we're talking about, it's a little difficult to give a definite answer. But I would fall back, I guess, on what I said earlier about the single most important job of the writing sample being to convince the evaluators that you do know how to write effectively for general readers.
Does the writing sample have to be one piece of writing, or can it be several pieces that add up to 20 pages?
It cannot be several pieces. It needs to be one piece, and there's specific instructions about that in the notice of funding opportunity, explaining what is and what's not allowable as one piece. And I don't have it all off the top of my head, but you would be allowed to submit several sections of a draft chapter. So you could sort of abridge and piece those together, explaining what you've left out, but you couldn't submit an article that was published in this magazine in 2018 and an article that was published in another magazine in 2020 and have them add up to 20 pages. You have to give us a unified work in your writing sample. And again, I refer you to the detailed instructions about writing samples that are contained in the notice of funding opportunity, because we do make an effort to address sort of the various questions that people have had in the past about what constitutes an allowable writing sample.
If you have written documentary scripts that have been produced on major networks, does that qualify as previously published work?
No, it would have to be a published piece of writing, and in that case, the form of publication is the documentary film, which is not what we have in mind. And there is a stipulation about audio transcripts not being usable to satisfy that requirement. Since we're getting a number of questions about whether certain things meet the requirement for previous publications, I'd just like to mention to people that we do have other programs. If you don't meet the publication requirement for the Public Scholars Program, you might consider looking at the NEH Fellowships Program or the NEH Summer Stipends Program, because neither of those imposes a requirement for previous publications. Most applicants do have previous publications in those programs, but it's not required to be eligible. The other thing about those programs is that they don't have the Public Scholars Program's emphasis on reaching general audiences. But even so, both of those programs are suitable for book projects, so you might investigate the NEH Fellowships Program and the NEH Summer Stipends Program.
A number of historical narratives online point to various NEH initiatives. How does one identify them to see if one's project fits in with them, and how important is doing so?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll make this one the last answer, since we're just on the top of the hour now. We don't currently have an announced initiative, special initiative in effect in the Public Scholars Program. And you may see references to special initiatives in the sample applications that we post, but I would not expend great energy in shaping a project to answer an initiative, even in cases where initiatives are in force. And the reason is that we review every funded project to see whether it fits under a special initiative or not. And even if a project doesn't explicitly mention an initiative, but it's a good fit, we'll recognize that in our review and designate it as a project funded under that initiative. So what you really want to do is be true to your project in your conception and presentation of it without trying to shape it to fit an initiative. And at the moment, as I said, we don't have any special initiatives referenced in the Notice of Funding Opportunity in this round of the Public Scholars Program anyway. All right, I appreciate everyone's attention. Thank you for your interest in the program. And if you do have additional questions that we weren't able to answer, please feel free to send us an email at publicscholars@neh.gov or give us a call at 202-606-8200. Thanks again.